In this video, I'll refinish this old table. I found this table in a thrift store. It's a small table with a glass top. The finish was in rough shape, so it would need to be refinished. It looks like something either spilled on it in a few spots, or maybe somebody tried to apply some stain to touch it up, but you can see where something dripped down the legs. It has this neat little saucer thing on the bottom that was probably intended to hold a potted plant. First thing I did was to remove the glass top, and it was just held on by a few of these clips. Then I could start disassembling the piece. It had a couple of nails driven into one of the joints in the bottom, so first I had to remove those. Nails can be pretty tough to get out, but in this case the heads of the nails were still somewhat accessible, and I was eventually able to pull them out. Once the nails were out, it came apart easily. And the little plant holder also came off pretty easily. I just had to use some screwdrivers to pry it off. Next, it was time to strip off the old finish, and I used a combination of scrapers and a chemical stripper. I started with the plant holder, and this is where I used the chemical stripper. I didn't want to use scrapers on this because of the shape of it. I wouldn't be able to get into the concave areas with the scraper I have, so the chemical stripper seemed like a better idea. And I just applied it with a brush, let it sit for a while, and then wiped it off with some fine steel wool and mineral spirits. On the rest of the piece, I was able to scrape the finish off. And I used a utility knife blade and a cabinet scraper for this. There was a spot on the top, on the back edge. It was a black spot. That was probably a water stain. And to get this out, I used some oxalic acid. And I applied it over the whole top and let it dry. And once it had dried, there was still a hint of a spot there, but it was just a brown spot rather than the black. So it blended in with the rest of the wood better than the black spot would have. Once I was done removing the finish, I could move on to sanding. I started out with an orbital sander. But on the rounded edges, I did those by hand. I didn't use the sander because it could have flattened the curve. And then I sanded the entire piece again, but this time by hand. And I did this to remove any swirl marks that the orbital sander may have left. And I put a piece of tape at any joint line where two pieces of wood were glued together so that I didn't end up accidentally sanding past that line, since the grain changes direction on the other piece, and I would have ended up sanding across the grain if I had accidentally gone over that joint line. And if I sanded across the grain, it would have left marks that you would see once the finish was on. This table appeared to be made out of birch, and the wood wasn't particularly attractive. It had some scratches and stains that I couldn't get out. So I wanted to try to add some color to it and try to blend it all together. But birch can be really tough to stain. It tends to stain unevenly, it can get blotchy, but I decided to try anyway. So the first thing I did was to apply a coat of shellac, and this would seal the wood somewhat so that it wouldn't absorb too much stain. And once the shellac was dry, then I applied the stain, and the stain that I used was a gel stain, which is thicker than a liquid stain, so it doesn't get absorbed into the wood as much. And I was hoping that would also help in getting a more even color. But once I got the stain on, I didn't like the way it looked. It was a nice color, But the way that the wood had absorbed the stain almost looked like somebody had just pressed some dirt down into the grain. So I removed as much of that stain as I could with some mineral spirits, and then I sanded off whatever was left, and then moved on to Plan B. Plan B was to use lacquer toner, which is basically lacquer with some color added to it. And this doesn't get absorbed into the wood like stain does. It mostly just sits on top of the wood, more like paint. So it's a lot easier to get an even finish. So you don't have the kind of problems that you do sometimes with stain, with blotchiness and things like that. So I just sprayed it on and tried to build it up a little bit at a time. If you apply too much of this, then it does start to look like paint. So I was trying to avoid that. Once that toner was dry, it was time to apply a top coat. And I could have just sprayed a clear lacquer over it, but instead I decided to put some wipe-on polyurethane on because I like the little bit of color that the polyurethane adds. It's subtle, but it helps to bring the whole thing together. Once the finish was dry, then I glued the pieces together. And I put some tape over the finish at the joints to try to avoid getting any glue squeeze out onto the new finish. And I almost forgot to glue on the little plant holder thing. And the last step was to put the glass top back on. There were some chips in the glass top, but they weren't sharp, so I just chose to leave them for now. And here it is, all finished. Thanks for watching.